Presenting today is our director, Dr. Evgeny Pakhomov, and his lab. And just a quick introduction from my part. I've known Evgeny for a very long time now, and I can tell you that my early experience with him was in the Southern Ocean, in the Antarctic, and one of the things I very quickly realized in interacting with Evgeny was that he's one of the preeminent experts in Antarctic ecology, and has worked, I think, over more than 3 decades now in the Southern Ocean, and has made many telling contributions on the ecology and biology of systems and species. He has some favorites. One of those is sulfur thompsonite. He's done some really seminal work on tunicates. Also worked extensively on krill biology, and made an important contribution to our understanding of myctophid ecology in the Southern Ocean. And I think people use that work globally as well. But he has diverse interests and has worked in many parts of the world, and from coastal to offshore systems. And so it's a pleasure to send him on his way to telling us about his lab and let his students present.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. And Brian, for a long time ago, I was involved in his supervision of his master's thesis. I think I partially was involved in him to become biological oceanographer as well. That voyage in the Southern Ocean was one of the invitations we made to him while he was actually doing freshwater stuff. We turned him up around. So, okay, I'll start today and Zooplankton and Micronekton Lab. And I believe everybody knows who I am. Evgeny Pakhomov, and I'm director of this institute. However, I'm also a professor at the Ocean and Atmospheric Sciences, just across the road, and I'm affiliated with the Pakhomov Institute. My Pakhomov Lab, some of them have already seen. And the question was very interesting. How can I characterize what I do? You will see that my research is super diverse, and I'm doing lots of different things. And it actually took me some time to formulate it in my head. What do I do? What do I study? What is my main interest? So I would like to say I study ecosystems and everything within them. The ecosystem, I study species individually. I then study the species interactions between each other. I study how they're distributed, how they contribute to the cycle of the major elements in the Earth. And very recently I was interested how the system will change, or the systems will change when really the climate change in our planet. And that's probably one. It's still mouthful, and you will see a little bit later why. I'd like to start where I'm from. I'm from Siberia. So this is, I found this in the Google Earth, which is incredible. This is my school where I graduated from. If you know a little bit about the music world, there was a tenor who recently passed away in Spain, Russian. His name again? We actually graduated from the same school. And at that time, I didn't really want to become a marine biologist, because the place where I was born, if you imagine map and Soviet Union, whatever it is, if you cross the line from east to west in the middle, and you cross line right in the middle vertically, right there would be the town where I was born. So, the furthest away from the ocean possible. And I was actually quite good in in mathematics and physics and chemistry, and I like to build things myself. Actually, during this time, it's me, by the way. I'm already teaching someone. So, I had two passions. They both were associated with the blue color. Blue skies and the blue water. I actually wanted to become a pilot. So, however, my health wasn't good enough, and I didn't want to become a mechanic. So my second passion, which I turned to after this passion was kind of turned down, is to become a marine biologist. And it's actually happened in just 2 years before I finished my high school. And I really like this quote, that how inappropriate to call this planet Earth when clearly it is the ocean. Because there's a lot of blue stuff there in the ocean, and that's why I really decided to do that. However, it took me from my mother town, which is somewhere here, right here, to Kazan, which is where I got into the university in 1978. I left town after graduating in high school and became a student in the Department of Invertebrate Zoology, because I believe that will me straight to the marine biology, marine ecology. So I did it 5 years and graduated in Kazan in 1983. After this, I got immediately a job in a Southern Research Institute for Marine Fisheries and Oceanography in the Crimea Peninsula, which is right here, where I worked for 10 years. And at that time, I really looked how it works, how the fisheries works. That's why I really appreciated all the fisheries research. During this time, I was actually did a part-time PhD studies in Moscow. This is the Shishov Institute of Oceanology in Russian Academy of Sciences. And although I've been working full-time and we had at that time 2 kids already, I actually graduated, did my PhD in about 4 years doing this part-time. Well, it was long days and long weekends, and so but nothing changed so that far. After this, graduating from the university and finishing my PhD, I got a postdoctoral position at Rhodes University in South Africa. That's where I met Brian in a couple of years. And I was working in the Southern Ocean Group as a researcher, well, first as a postdoc for 3 years, and then as a researcher and senior researcher, leading this group in the end. And that was going for about 8 years. It was a really lovely time, and most of the work was in the Southern Ocean. At about 2001, the funding of that group for salaries disappeared, and we had to really find our position somewhere else. So I got a position at the University of Fort Hare, quite famous university. Quite a few political leaders, African political leaders, graduated from that university. And it was actually a very nice time of my life. It was really nice to teach black underprivileged students in South Africa. During this time, I got Alexander von Humboldt Fellowship, which I spent in Bremerhaven, which is northern Germany, in 2002, for a year. And that's where I started applying for Canadian expositions, and eventually I got one. So in 2003, I moved to the University of British Columbia, where I am still. I'm still here, okay. Fine. However, if you look where I've done my research, and I couldn't believe that it's actually started almost 40 years ago. It sounds like a very, very long time, so I'm very old. So my first expedition was when I was in the second year of the university to the White Sea. And after I graduated, I did actually work here, because I work here, I worked in the Black Sea. But most of my research has been dedicated to the Southern Ocean. And this is all expeditions I participated or worked with or analyzed data and so on. And you can see that from the Southern Ocean, we started explaining a little bit further north, then to the tropics. And this is my also university expedition where I did my master's on the Humboldt Street, by the way. And this is now where quite a bit of my interest is lying as well, in the open ocean and the North Pacific, in the coastal environment as well. So you'll hear about this a lot. But this is a lot of ship time. And so, one thing I would like to say is that when I was at the Fisheries Institute, it was kind of one thing which struck me. There was a huge reductionism kind of approach. Scientists would focus on one species of fish, and they would know absolutely everything about the species. But they would know absolutely nothing about the environment or even interactions with other species. And that's what really bucked me right from the beginning when I started working in the institute. So I started really doing inter and disciplinary work. So I really talked to the physical oceanographers, I really talked to the phytoplanktonologists, I really wanted to connect what I study, plankton, zooplankton, with fish. So that's where most of my interest came from. And if we look into what it is, so I'm a biological oceanographer, and using jargon, physical, biological, I'm interested in physical, biological interactions and marine ecosystem trophodynamics. Studying Southern Ocean really gave me a big boost understanding that how the whole system works. So I wanted really to understand large regulating mechanisms of the systems, and that's where I kind of expanded from a single species into like a ecosystem and a food web and so on. Also, it was my naive belief when I started working in Southern Ocean that it is a pristine system. It is by far not a pristine system because we are the humans wiped out in the 50s and 60s all the whales from the Southern Ocean, or majority of them. Some of the species near to near extinction. So, however, it was still relatively pristine compared to other systems. And during all my career, broadened my interest. I really started interested in coastal ecosystems, and this was initiated in South Africa. Invasive species problems, when I came here, stabilized loop approach as a tool to understand the interactions, really expanded into the mesopelagic zone, which I believed was a black box. We knew very little about this, and we still know very little, and how the ecosystem would respond to climate change. That's partially what I'm doing right now. But if we do my interest, I'm studying, as Brian mentioned, anything from plankton to fish. Not really like very big fish, except eating. But like I have Micronekton, macroplankton stuff. Let's say 2 to about 220 centimeters. But also the system structure function by geography and biogeochemical coupling. And I do this from Southern Ocean still to the now British Columbia, and from the coast to the open ocean, tropics to the polar regions, essentially doing all kinds of species everywhere where it will take me. I'm very interested to start new projects somewhere else all the time, which probably occurs. But it definitely gives me the opportunity to work in environments like the University of British Columbia, or even this institute, to extend beyond the marine of the field of marine ecology, kind of going into the fish, into the fisheries, into the management, and at the same time going into like really fine processes at the lower or basis of the food webs, like physics as well, including chemistry. So just a very quick list of my contributions, a few of the contributions. So they mostly listed here, and they're mostly about Southern Ocean. So I did really advanced understanding individual organisms, and this would be the Southern Ocean like tunicats, sulfur Thompson, as I mentioned, Antarctic krill, and other non-gelatinous species. I did work lots of studies on individual species and their biology and ecology, but also their place in interactions, how they interact, how much they graze, who eats them, and so on and so forth. And I still do mostly tunicats these days. This is my passion still. I really evaluated, from my point of view, in Southern Ocean, Zooplankton and Micronekton along with oceanobiological pump. There were some work like how important ptophits or carnivorous zooplankton, which before this nobody knew about. Really, I did lots of work on the biogeographic zonation of the Southern Ocean, and that was kind of one of my postdoctoral themes at the time. I did, when I moved here, I did an international intercomparative study of Micronekton sampling gears, which is not finalized yet. It's a still huge issue because every country has their own gear, and nobody really ever done any intercomparison between them. But we did try this through PICES. And one of also passions, long-time passions, was life support system of the island system, and I used as a case study principal diamonds, but not the principal diamonds you're thinking about. There are another principal diamonds which are south in the Southern Ocean, belong to South Africa. So, and it's a subantarctic island system, very unique, very interesting, and there are big changes happened in this ecosystem, and we try to understand what is supporting this system. From understanding that, we could actually make predictions and we could explain the changes to the, let's say, top predators in this island. But those are only few which mostly in the past, except maybe pelagic tunicats and Lysis rapinata and so on and so forth. So now I would like to really say, if the lab would be divided, I would say there are four major themes: estuarine ecology, coastal biological processes, which lab does, surface and midwater ecosystems, and the Southern Ocean ecology. So each of these, which I'll just now pass to my capable group, will be somehow presented here. And in terms of this, it was like reverse net ecosystem study, Strait of Georgia, Zooplankton, Fraser River estuary. The highlighted one will be actually presented here, because we don't have time to present everything. Trophic gantlet zooplankton dynamics, feeding ecology of Pacific herring, feeding ecology of forage fish, North Pacific isoscapes in surface and midwater ecosystem, trophic transfer efficiency, zooplankton biomass spectrum meta-analysis, Micronekton in the ecosystem, mostly for the active carbon transport. And finally, zooplankton ecophysiology in the Southern Ocean, which I continue to do, but mostly we'll talk today about some work, most recent work, just hot of the press, pelagic tunicat biology and modeling, as well as importance of the climate change in the Southern Ocean solar system. So, from now on, I'm just kind of giving this to my team to present their individual projects under the umbrella of what I just presented, four major themes. The first one will be Joanne.
Hi, I'm Joanne, and I study zooplankton and estuaries. The overarching goal of my thesis is to predict how changes in climate are going to influence zooplankton in the estuary, but today I'm just going to talk to you about basic zooplankton ecology in the Fraser. So not a lot of work has been done on zooplankton in this estuary, so my first step was to describe basic zooplankton dynamics, and to do this we did a monitoring program from summer of 2013 to spring of 2016. We collected zooplankton and measured associated water temperature, salinity, etc. We focused primarily on the main or the south arm of the estuary, but we also did some sampling on the north and the middle arms. Just to note, some people seem to restrict the estuary to the outer banks, but the delta is also included in the estuary, and the salt ledge can extend at least as far inland as the Petula Bridge in Westminster. So here I'm going to focus on the copepods, which are the dominant component of the zooplankton. If any of you have met my former lab mate, Natalie Mahara, I'm sure she's told you how amazing copepods are. So I'm not finished my samples here, but so far what I'm seeing is that copepod abundance in the channels is lowest in the spring and highest in the summer. So this isn't a typical pattern. Normally we see highest abundances in the spring and lowest abundances in the winter. Also, overall abundance isn't typical. So we're seeing median copepod abundance is about 500 individuals per cubic meter, and in the size range I look at, which is greater, my mesh size is 100 microns, we would typically see abundances greater than 10,000 per cubic meter, and often up to 100 or multiple hundreds of thousands per cubic meter. So why are abundances in this estuary so low? To get to that, we can look at how abundance varies spatially in the estuary, as well as species composition. So in addition to sampling in the channels, I've also done some sampling in the sloughs. In the sloughs, we do see higher abundances of copepods, and in D slough in particular, and that's by McMassey Tunnel, if you're familiar, we can regularly sample abundances in excess of 10,000 individuals per cubic meter. So to understand why abundances in sloughs are higher, we can look at species composition, and for our purposes, we can broadly divide zooplankton estuaries into freshwater, estuarine, and marine. So the estuarine species are the only ones that are going to grow and thrive in a brackish water environment, and they're shown here in green. So you can see that the abundances, so the slough is the panel on the top, the abundances in the sloughs are primarily due to estuarine species. They contribute far less to the total abundance in the channels. So estuarine species are endemic to estuaries. If they can't survive either fully fresh or fully marine waters. Well, they're not a diverse group of species, but they're able to achieve enormous abundances, and they're central to pelagic estuarine food webs. So the main difference, or the obvious difference between sloughs and channels, is water residence time, and I think that that's what explains the difference in abundance that we're seeing. So the water just sticks around in the sloughs longer than it does in the channel. So life is challenging. Life in estuaries is challenging to all organisms, but zooplankton in particular, because they're not able to swim against current, they face the unique challenge of infection. So net flow in an estuary is always out, but if these guys are swept out to sea, they're going to die. So estuarine, copepods, estuarine zooplankton have employed a variety of mechanisms to retain themselves in the estuary. And I've got a couple of other chapters that address this, but long story short, copepods here do that too, but it's not enough to retain and grow populations in the channel areas of the estuary. So water residence time in this estuary is too low to support and grow populations of estuarine copepods. Why is that important? So I think that's important because we caused that, right? So this all, of course, used to be floodplain. By removing the floodplain and dredging the channels, we've sped up the flow of water through this estuary, and by speeding and therefore reducing the zooplankton production, which of course means less food for higher growth levels. Like I said, I did see higher abundances in the sloughs. So sloughs can act potentially as a refuge to estuarine zooplankton, allowing them to retain populations in the estuary and potentially seeding the main channel. So thank you for listening. I'm always excited to talk about the Fraser River Estuary and zooplankton in general, if you ever want to talk.
Thanks, Joanne. So thanks everyone for coming. I'm Vanessa Fladmark. I'm a master's student at Pakhomov Lab, and I'm going to be presenting today on behalf of the Coastal Biological Processes team. And so there's 5 of us that fit under this umbrella, so we'll be talking very briefly about overall goals as opposed to details about any specific project. So just quick introductions. The first 3 are master's students. We have PhD and postdoc. Natalie Mahara recently graduated, working on zooplankton. Samantha James, master's student, working on juvenile sockeye diets and working on juvenile pink and chum salmon diets. PhD student Yulia Egorova, working on juvenile sockeye growth rates. And Marina Espinasse, working on juvenile salmon feeding in all of the North Pacific. So, starting off, the first 4 of us work in coastal British Columbia, and we look at this really interesting area of the Discovery Islands and Johnson Strait. Because of the physics of the environment, it has a very different system than the Strait of Georgia, for example. So the Strait of Georgia has seasonal variation. It gets stratification in the surface layer, which leads to phytoplankton production and zooplankton production, like seasonal blooms. So there's lots of food in the surface layer for salmon, as opposed to this area, which salmon have to migrate through before they hit the ocean. And it's lower productivity in the surface layer. It's very, very well mixed throughout. So there's very sparse prey fields for the salmon, and that's the main thing that we're looking at. Pink and chum and sockeye all co-migrate through this area at the same time. And so we want to look at a bottom-up approach to these ecosystem dynamics. The types of zooplankton that are available, how do they influence the salmon on their migration? What does this mean for their growth and survival? And the type of zooplankton that's available, how does this relate to the temperature, the salinity, the chlorophyll, these types of physical bottom-up processes? So that leads us to Natalie's project. She looked at zooplankton in these different environments, So the Johnson Strait region is that very cold water at the surface, that well-mixed area I mentioned. The Discovery Islands is this intermediate area, kind of mixed, kind of stratified, depending on where you are. And the northern Strait of Georgia with that warm surface layer and high production compared to lower zooplankton production. And so the types of communities that she found were very, very different by these regions as well. So even though they're kind of close spatially, they're very, very different in the types of zooplankton that she found. And if the types of zooplankton are different, that means the food available for salmon is going to be different. And so Sam and I are working on sockeye and pink and chum, as I mentioned, and we're going to use her data on sockeye as an example. We're looking at what zooplankton are they eating and how much are they eating. And so this is a gut fullness index, a measurement of feeding success, how much are they feeding, compared to this average value of fullness. And so the axis is along their migration route. The Fraser River is over there, and they migrate through to the open ocean over here. And so what we're seeing is that there's these high feeding areas at the entry and exit points, and then in the middle there's this trophic gauntlet area where they're not eating a lot of zooplankton relative to their body size. And so we're also looking at what types of zooplankton they're eating. They're eating calanoid copepods in the Johnson Strait, and they're eating larvaceans in the Discovery Islands region. And so, in simple terms, crunchies versus squishies. So, if they're eating different things in different amounts, the amount of time they spend in these different areas, it can have a really big impact on their growth and survival. And so how do we measure growth and survival? That leads us into Yulia's project, where she's looking at juvenile sockeye salmon growth rate dynamics. So she studies a cohort of juvenile salmon, and as they're in the early phase of their marine migration, and then 2 years later, the same cohort of fish that have successfully returned to spawn. She looks at the early growth rate dynamics of these fish to kind of compare who are the winners and losers, what kind of factors were important for them to survive through the ocean migration. She looks at this in two different ways, by looking at the physical characteristics of otoliths, the physical markers, as well as chemical analysis on the trace element profiles of the fish to figure out what was the timing of the migration, what was the speed of their migration, how big were they when they entered the ocean, things like this. And so with this information, we can kind of reconstruct what environmental conditions they experienced in their early marine life. What were the kind of feeding conditions available to them? And by looking at recent data as well as archived data from the 1970s, we can compare pre and post collapse and what was important for survival then versus now. And so just to recap, these projects are more than just the sum of their parts. They all work together. So environmental conditions influencing zooplankton, influencing what salmon have to eat, which influences their growth, which is also affected by the environmental conditions like temperature, salinity, whatnot. So making sure we have a good understanding of all these things and not just focusing on one species, as Evgeny mentioned earlier. Interconnected, figuring all this out so that we can better understand what salmon need to survive and how we can better predict their returns for better fisheries models, better fisheries management. And so that's the coastal Pacific, coastal British Columbia. So now zooming out to last but not least, Marina's project on salmon diets in all of the North Pacific. So this cool project is looking at literature from as far back as 1936, all across the Pacific Ocean, all 6 species of salmonids. So looking at coastal Oregon all the way around the Pacific Rim to Russia and Japan, mostly focusing on the coast, but open ocean data as well, and looking at what types of zooplankton are they eating, how much are they eating, what size is the salmon, how many empty stomachs, to get a better understanding of salmon dynamics on a bigger scale. And so by putting all 5 of these projects together, we can understand what salmon are going through as they migrate from freshwater to seawater during this trophic gauntlet area, and once they hit the open ocean and they pass through all these different country boundaries and the high seas, so that we can better understand and protect this really important Pacific species. And now that we have a global perspective, I'd love to pass it over to the Service Midwater Ecosystems team.
My name is Boris Espinasse, and I will introduce you this team. We are focusing mainly on open ocean and the process that occurs there in terms of productivity, transfer efficiency between tropical and gelatinous envision. So it's quite mixed what we are doing here. There are 4 people working in this team. I will introduce works for Florian and myself. Florian is a new PhD student. He just started here. He will be working on trophic interaction in planktonic communities in the North Pacific, and with a special focus on gelatinous zooplankton. It's important because with climate change we expect more and more the gelatinous bloom to occur, and we don't know yet how this can affect the rest of the food web. So to get answer to this question is going to have access to a different time series that will allow him to look into the internal variability of gelatinous zooplankton in terms of abundance and community composition as well. He's going to use some new technique like EDMA to characterize better his community. And in the end, you want to be able to predict and model this gelatinous bloom and see what kind of impact it will have in the other components of the food web. I'm myself doing a postdoc here. I'm working with Brian and Evgeny. The main topic of my postdoc is model spatial variability of the productivity in the ocean. I'm working mainly in the Northeast Pacific. I'm using the stable isotope approach. So we got zooplankton sample from two programs, IMP and CPR, and we run them for stable isotopes and maps the spatial distribution of the isotope value. Then the aim is to model what we call these isoscapes, so with spatial distribution of the isotope value, and to be able to predict them for different years. And for that we use satellite data. Here you have an example, it's croquet, but we also use sea surface temperature and sea level and rates, for example. And once you have these isoscapes, you can use it for example, to get insight in the carbon and nitrogen cycles to understand better how much carbon will sediment in the ocean. You can develop an ocean productivity index. You can get a stable trophic baseline, which is useful when you want to know at which trophic level your fish are. You can compare with this baseline. And you can track fish migration pathways by comparing salmon values and the isoscape. So here as an example, it's ocean productivity. So it is what nitrogen isoscape looks like for one specific year. So we have a series of them, like for 20 years. And if you correlate that with a large copepod abundance from the CPR program, different area emerge with different correlation between the abundance and the isoscapes, which is good because it means we can say something using the isotope value about zooplankton. Another example is salmon tracking. So in this case, we use a relationship between carbon-14 in salmon scales and the sea surface temperature. And we were able to define here the potential feeding area for a specific stock of sockeye salmon. In the 6-9 months period, they start to swim back to the river where they're going to swim. So these results were quite encouraging, so we decided to develop that further, and we are now in the process to get scales from different stock to cover the whole North Pacific and to run again business for different stocks.
So I'm going to present on behalf of Lian Kwon and myself. So first I would like to present the Lian's work. And first of all, I would like to emphasize the importance of the zooplankton in the global ocean. So as you know, zooplankton play a critical role connecting the phytoplankton with the higher trophic levels, as a result connecting the phytoplankton with the valuable commercial fisheries. However, we know very little about the secondary production of zooplankton in the global ocean, basically mainly due to the reason that available techniques are either very expensive or they require a lot of time, and sometimes they can be not very reliable. As a result, there were a need of developing a better model that will predict the secondary production of the zooplankton. So what Lian is doing, she is designing a model based on the size-based biomass spectra that will be able to estimate the secondary production as well as the trophic efficiently in the Northeast Pacific. So what is the biomass spectra theory? It's basically a theory that says that pelagic organisms in the global ocean are largely size-structured, meaning that with the decrease in the size of the organism, there is a decrease in the abundance. So using this type of relationship, she's trying to design a model that will give you the estimate of the secondary production and trophic efficiency. So what she was planning to do is design this model and compare with the 3 available methods that is now existing for estimating the secondary production. So she can quantify her model using these methods. Also, outcome of her model will give you such important estimates as secondary production and trophic efficiency, but she also will be able to estimate the growth and mortality in the Northeast Pacific region. She also will be able, combining the data with the primary productivity and available data of the fishery productions, to compare how correlated are the secondary productions estimated from her model with the fisheries production. And as a result, if they find the correlation using modeling the effect of the climate change, specifically she will be looking at the changes in temperature, she will be able to see how the changing climate can affect both the secondary production and the fisheries productivity. So why her research is very important, because through her project she will be able to advance science by providing a better and more reliable estimates of the secondary production. And also her estimates of the trophic efficiency will help fisheries managers to reduce some uncertainty that is available now in use of the values, especially the models that use food web structure. So myself, I'm focusing more on the mesopelagic ocean. So for those who is not very familiar, this is the area of the ocean that is approximately located between 200 and 1,000 meter depth. So basically this area characterized by the low level of light availability. So photosynthesis, this area is no longer possible, but there is still detectable amount of the available for the organisms to distinguish diurnal cycles. Because of that, it's usually also known as a twilight zone of the global ocean. And recent publication found that there is a vast majority of marine resources that can be found in the ocean. Specifically, the recent estimate of 1 billion ton of mesopelagic fish could be found in the mesopelagic zone. However, mesopelagic fishes are not only one taxa available in this area, so this area have a lot of other different organisms. However, their global biomass estimates are not known up to date. So the goal of my project is basically to find out the distribution and the biomass of the mesopelagic, Zooplankton and Micronekton communities. So first of the question I have is how much we know up to date, and where and how much biomass is available that already exists in the literature. So here is the example of the 2 online databases that is available to download. So first one is the copypod. Although it has a name of copypod, it actually consists information of various marine taxa. And recently published biotime database also contain millions of records, not only marine and terrestrial too, but here I just representing the data from the marine stuff. So how much of this data set I actually have a data from the mesopelagic? So if you sort this data by the depth, so I assume the depth of the mesopelagic between 200 and 1,000, you can see that very few data points are available for the mesopelagic community. So what my work was going into all published literature available up to date and collecting the data of all the Zooplankton and Micronekton in the mesopelagic zone. So this is my current progress. So as you see, there are a lot of data available and a lot of studies have been done in mesopelagic, but it has not been systematized yet in this one complete data set. So as a result, my first step will be pulling all the data together and creating a Zooplankton and Micronekton database. And by using this complete data set, I would be able to combine it with the environmental data and model the global biogeography of various Zooplankton and Micronekton taxa. As well as if I know the global distribution, I will be able to estimate the biomass of each community and as well as global estimate of the biomass. And again, knowing the interplay between environmental factors and the existing biomass of these organisms, I would be able to estimate how the changing climate condition can affect this distribution and as well biomass values.
So I'll be talking about the Southern Ocean aspect of the lab. And so I'm Natasha Henschke, I'm a postdoc with Evgeny, and so my project's really just modelling populations of Salpa thompsoni. And so just in case you don't know, this is Salpa thompsoni, it's a pelagic tunicate that is one of the major grazers in the Southern Ocean, along with Antarctic krill. And so as I'm sure you're all aware, Antarctic krill is a baseline organism, everything it eats there is really important for whales and fish and birds and everything like that. Whereas salps, they're not really as important in the food chain. They're 90% water, so they don't really have a high nutritional content, and so not many things actually feed on them. However, the thing that's important to note is that salps can feed up to 3 times faster than krill, so they tend to consume similar things, so they are potentially a major competitor. Now, it's not so bad though, because generally the distribution of salps and krill are segregated. So krill really like this area close to the shelf, the cooler ice edge, whereas salps are generally around this area here where it's a little bit warmer, the Antarctic polar front. But we have seen in recent years that there has been a shift in the salp abundance a little bit further south. So this plot shows you krill and salp distribution that change over decades, and so you can see decreases in the red colours and increases in the blue colours, and so what we have seen is that there's been an increase in salp abundance closer towards Antarctica, so where the krill generally dominate. And potentially this has been suggested to be a reason why we've seen this decline in krill abundance in the 90s. So what we wanted to study first was to see whether or not salps can actually live in these cooler waters. And so there has been hypotheses going around saying that salps don't really like cold water because it's a detriment to their reproduction. And so the reason why they think it's a detriment is because salps have asexual and sexual reproduction, and so they think that when they have the embryo, when they give birth to their single embryo, when it's too cold, these embryos are often found to be a little bit damaged, and so we don't really think that they like cold water. And so if you stop one side of the life cycle, you can't really complete the rest of it. And so what we did was we got all of these data sets that Evgeny has measured, all of these things like salp, embryo fitness, and size distribution, and everything like that, to see if we could actually test this hypothesis. And we did find that there was a significant decline, or a significant increase in the number of failed embryos in colder waters and waters where there was less chlorophyll. So there is a limitation on how well salp populations can occur in these cold, low chlorophyll areas that krill like. So then we wanted to extend on this and see why do we still get these large swarms of salp. So this was just an example of what we caught on one of our recent voyages. And so this net was just full of Salpa thompsoni, as you can see. And so we wanted to know, what causes them to swarm, why are they where they are in the Southern Ocean. And so to look at this, we developed a population model. And I won't really go into too much detail, but what we put in the model was chlorophyll A and temperature as drivers of growth, reproduction, mortality, and things like that to estimate salp abundance and salp biomass in different areas of the Southern Ocean. And so based on the areas where we do have data, so this plot shows you observations in the grey bars, and we ran several different hypothesis scenarios to get the best model. And the best one, which is the black line, was a relatively good fit for long-term biomass of salps around the Antarctic Peninsula. And so now we have a pretty good model of salp biomass. We want to extend on this and to, I guess, look at several questions. So we want to know whether or not we saw these increases close to the coast. Is it because they were infected there, because we know that they don't like cold waters, or will salp populations shift further south in the future? And so Evgeny's already started work on this, which he...
Talking about shifts, so we have this very nice quantitative information from the krill base, which we created 2003, I think. And however, you can see how patchy and how limited it is. So we decided to really go a step further because we had enough information, and jointly with try to model now the distribution of krill and salps in the Southern Ocean. So these models are probability of their occurrence. So that means it's model of habitat of the krill and salps. And, well, since it's been done a couple of times for krill, it's kind of never been done officially for salps. And you can see that, well, and these models, by the way, describe more than 97% of variation, so they're pretty good apparently, and it's very close to what we know about their distribution. So these species, again, show exactly the same pattern. Krill kind of likes cold environments, while salps like warm environments. And the circles, which is presented here, it's the center of the population kind of distributed around Antarctica. You can see that they do not really overlap. There's a huge bit. However, they do overlap in some areas. And that's what was very interesting, because if we do this for both species separately, it's interesting, but I mean, nobody really studied their overlap. So because we had a model, we had the opportunity to look into the overlap, and we played this from now versus, for example, 100 years from now, and in two different scenarios. And this is showing you anomaly. The redder the color is, the more overlap occurs. What happens during this time, is that salps, krill is moving towards the continent, kind of pressed towards the continent, because it has nowhere to go, it's continent there. And salps are following, and the blue colors here and there indicate that krill disappears from this area, but salps are still there. And what is happening is that, yes, krill disappears from the north, salps shift further south, they follow the krill, they catch up, and eventually they overlap, and a bad scenario, or businesses, whatever scenario, 8.5, indicates that there's a huge overlap between those two species. What it means is that those two species actually have to somehow survive together. And I would say that historically, both of them been living there for millions of years, they had to learn how to live together, and we found some mechanisms how they do this. However, we know very little, because we only hypothesize how they interact, but nobody really studied their like in situ interactions, except like few studies. I've done a couple, maybe other things. So, and we also do not know absolutely anything how they will behave in the coastal environment, because it could be more acidic, more cold, more predators, whatever. And so it's actually opening lots of new questions. And I'd like to stop on this and move to acknowledge two things. First of all, this beautiful presentation is done by Yulia. She has done all of that. Amazing. And secondly, you probably heard several times, and if you've been in the presentation of Pakhomov Lab, you can see that there is a lot of overlap, lots of interconnections between our two labs. So we supervise lots of students together, which indicates that we have a very similar interest. But we have our niches, and we still work together in some open ocean, coastal environments, and in the Southern Ocean. I hope it's going to continue like this in the future. And while we're asking questions, you can see some funny pictures of us. Thank you very much.